My name is Don Simpson. Some of my friends and colleagues have described me as the chief explorer of the innovation expedition. And I'm wanting to talk a bit tonight about stories from what I've described as my global odyssey, my distinctive personal journey that has taken me to over 75 different countries around the world in my search for understanding cross-cultural harmony and helping people and organizations perform at a higher level in order to help make their community and the world a better place. So let me talk about an excerpt from Log Book 3 from my Global Odyssey, which deals with the connecting with the African diaspora in Canada and coming to grips with the roots of racism. I want to talk about my introduction to the African diaspora in Canada through a community in southwestern Ontario known as Buxton. And I start with a quote from an event that took place at the Buxton Museum in 2009. It is my aim in this presentation to show that by excluding First Nations people, Black people, and other people of color from its early narrative, a white Canada has been better able to write, erase, and rewrite bodies of color and present itself in various conflicting images from color blindness to multiculturalism, from tolerant and benevolent to a nation that is justified in its policing and regulating of bodies of color. Also, and perhaps most importantly, Canada tends to erase people of color and First Nation people from its earlier histories in order to control who gets to be Canadian. And they do it by establishing whiteness as the original definition of Canada. Now, those remarks were made by Fiola Jacobs, one of 4 student panel members from York University in Toronto, who were presenting brief insights from their serious classroom efforts over the year to investigate the presence of stories of African Canadian experiences as presented in traditional Canadian literature programs. The setting for the above remarks was a symposium on Black history, part of the 85th annual Buxton Labor Day homecoming celebration in early September 2009. The event was held in this small farming community in southwestern Ontario, whose historic importance is still unknown to many Canadians. Other significant participants in this symposium were Dr. David Blight, director of the Gilder Lehrman Center for the Study of Slavery, Resistance, and Abolition at Yale University, and Velma Mae Thomas, creator of the Black Holocaust exhibit in the Shrine of the Black Madonna bookstore in Atlanta, Georgia. Moderators for the symposium were Michelle Johnson, assisted by Andrea Davis, both professors in the Harriet Tubman Institute for Research on the Global Migration of African Peoples at York University. As innovator in residence at the Harriet Tubman Institute, my role was to host our American guests and help introduce them to the Buxton community and its historic museum, which has had such an important influence on my life. It was exciting to watch the reactions of the 4 students, the noted scholar from Yale, and the charismatic public historian from Atlanta. The many myths of the Underground Railroad activities that now circulate widely in the United States were blown aside as they experienced firsthand the authentic stories of the initial efforts of fugitive slaves and free blacks who built this community of Buxton in the mid-19th century. David Blight, for instance, was visibly moved as he began to meet the descendants of famous black people about whom he had written and lectured about across the United States, Europe, and various other parts of the world. And here now in this tiny community in Canada, he was experiencing the results of the quiet, persistent, courageous, and creative efforts of the descendants of those fugitive slaves to keep the stories alive as a model to another generation. David and Velma returned to the United States energized by their brief Buxton experience and committed to keep connected to an evolving working group being organized by the Tubman Institute, the Buxton Museum, and other research and cultural groups to work to create a national network intent on spotlight and promoting the remarkable stories of African Canadians in the more than 400 years that they have been in Canada. In an earlier excerpt, I've described the 1950s London, Ontario, where I was living as a student. And I described it as a predominantly white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, and said that at that time I knew nobody among its 150,000 inhabitants who had ever traveled to Africa. Like most Londoners, I was completely unaware that less than an hour down the road was an entire community of people who, like me, felt a strong draw to Africa. And I was ignorant of the fact that there was a significant black population in my own city. So I was surprised when one day in 1963, there was a knock on the door of my West London home, and there on the step stood a black man who asked me if I was a school teacher who had gone to Africa and who was giving speeches about my experience. When I confirmed that I was, he invited me to come to what he called the BME Church on Grey Street in South London. And this church served a predominantly black congregation who were eager now to learn more about their African roots. I was intrigued and quickly accepted the offer, which was to end up profoundly shaping the direction of much of the rest of my life. On my visit to the church, I met their minister, and it was through him and his connection to the BME Church in Buxton that I first learned of the existence of this town populated by descendants of slaves fleeing America through the Underground Railroad. I learned later that BME stood for British Methodist Episcopal, and that many branches throughout southwestern Ontario were offshoots of the American-based AME, or African Methodist Episcopal Church. The AME began establishing churches ministering specifically to the black population in Upper Canada in the 1820s. And when the Fugitive Slave Act was passed in the U.S. in 1850, it became increasingly dangerous for African Canadian church officials to travel to AME annual conferences in the U.S. So they began to lobby for local church self-government, and by 1856 they had succeeded in creating the Canadian BME. The need for some churches might suggest that while Canada was officially against slavery, some white Canadians found it difficult to welcome former slaves as members of their church. Or perhaps that the former slaves preferred to create their own institutions rather than trying to fit into churches that felt foreign. Whatever the reason, it seems that for the most part, parallel black and white organizations evolved in many of the areas where the former slaves settled. Buxton was the largest of such places in what was then known as Canada West, a place that represented safety and freedom for hundreds of escaped slaves in the 1800s. The community became known as an innovative model of what could be achieved through collaborative action by courageous people who had a passion for breaking through the barriers of ignorance and prejudice. The people of Buxton, the Buxtonites, drained the swamps and built schools to ensure education for all. They created a community bank to help finance homes and factories. They exported the products of those factories to the United States. The economic and social models they created for Buxton proved highly successful, and they began to dream of building a free black nation somewhere in the world. And so they participated in expeditions to the Caribbean, to Central America, and to various parts of Africa. Indeed, they ended up signing an agreement with the Alaki of Abeokuta, a high official in what is now part of modern-day Nigeria. This agreement would have seen the Buxton model implemented in West Africa in an attempt to wean the local economy from dependence on serving as middlemen in slave trades. Then the American Civil War broke out, and 70 members of the Buxton community ended up joining the Union forces. Plans to embed their model in West Africa were scrapped as the community's attention suddenly turned south. Most, in running away from the U.S., from their slave masters, had left family in the U.S. and realized when the Civil War began that their first loyalty was to these family members, and that they were, in fact, still more American than African, even with all the problems they had faced in the United States. After the war, their attempt to use their model to aid in Southern Reconstruction, however, was thwarted by white carpetbaggers. Carpetbaggers, that's the pejorative term given to opportunistic white northerners who were bent on manipulating Reconstruction efforts to their own political and financial gain. These Northerners did not want to see the successful Buxton model of collaborative community self-reliance introduced in the southern United States. And so at a memorable community meeting in Buxton, whose records exist, we read of individuals being presented with the agonizing choice of staying on in Buxton and help strengthen that community, or returning to the United States as individuals in the hopes of making some personal contribution to the reconstruction of that post-Civil War society. Many chose to return to rejoin their family members throughout the USA, and they took their learnings and experiences from Canada with them. So while Buxton as a community never replicated its model on the grand scale once envisioned, former members certainly influenced the social and economic development of many American communities by helping to provide or create leadership for churches, schools, hospitals, businesses, and other community organizations. And the results of their efforts have been documented by some researchers now, including my dear late friend Vic Ullman, and are available if you'd like to read these stories. So then Buxton faced the challenge of keeping the past alive today. And for over 40 years, Labor Day in September in Buxton brings together the descendants of these early black pioneers in a celebration of this amazing story of the movement of African people and the impact of their journeys. For in 1924, Buxton initiated a homecoming designed to draw former residents back to the community to celebrate their past and keep their stories alive. The inaugural event was a one-day affair that took place in a pasture owned by Reginald and Minnie Robbins. And now it's a 4-day celebration featuring music, conferences, family baseball games, a raft of other activities, and a parade. Longtime inhabitant Earl Prince recently reminisced that the first parade started with a couple of horses and his son Brian's Shetland pony, and has grown exponentially from there. Earl has been in charge of the parade every year since 1953, except for one year when he says it rained and we didn't get to have the parade. This Buxton homecoming attracts thousands of visitors every Labor Day. In the early days, the visitors were largely descendants of former settlers, making pilgrimage back from all parts of Canada and the United States in search of family history. Increasingly respected historians are joining them from around the world, and a more general interested Canadian public. I attend those celebrations frequently, and the story of the celebrations and the museum that this group created to build on that celebration will appear in some other stories I will tell from my logbook. In 2007, I was present at the new Buxton National Historic Site Museum and participated in the blessing of the replica of what is known as the Freedom Bell. This bell was a replica of the original bell, a gift in the 1850s from the colored community in Pittsburgh. The original was hung in the steeple of St. Andrew's Church, where it remains today. The intent of the original donors of the bell was to inspire the ongoing commitment of the community to free others from bondage. In addition, the bell was rung each time another slave reached freedom in that community. And so I think of the Buxton Liberty Bell as something that tolls for all of us. And the first time I saw it, I found myself reminiscing about a powerful folk song of the civil rights movement in the 60s when we sang, "It's a bell about freedom, it rings about justice. It's a song about love between my brothers and my sisters all over this land." My introduction to the community of Buxton was to be a critical stimulus for me to direct some of my serious attention to capturing the historical stories of Canadians of African descent. My evolving interactions with members of this community surprisingly ended up providing me with a big, important theme that was to become the foundation of my PhD thesis. The Buxton story became another best practice example of the principles, processes, and leadership needed to achieve significant, successful community development anywhere. Most importantly, my interactions with the people of this community, particularly with those who created and have continued to sustain the museum, offered another special home away from home for me. I find that visits to this community are always, for me, calming, grounding, and providing inspirational personal experiences. Buxton has come to occupy a special place in my mind and in my heart. I will continue to make efforts to stay connected with my friends there. I plan to visit again during the 2015 Labor Day celebrations and hopefully bring a number of my colleagues so that they can enjoy their first experience in this very special community. Let the journey continue.